Greetings, constant listener land. It's Nick with your Far Middle latest installment, episode 199. That's one short of the magical number 200, something to look forward to next week. And I hope you turned your clocks ahead last weekend. And if you forgot to, well then, this podcast just explained why you've been late for everything so far this week. For this week's sports dedication, I'm going with an all-time great from a team sport that we never had an individual dedication for. We did dedicate an episode to the sport itself not that long ago in Far Middle history when we discussed the World War I Christmas truce on the Western Front, where enemy combatants came out of their trenches and played soccer, or football as it is known everywhere else in the world. But believe it or not, we never dedicated an episode of the Far Middle to an individual in the world's most famous sport. That changes today, folks, with a dedication to the player I believe to have been the most dynamic ever, the most charismatic ever, the most clutch ever, and one with also a troubling off-the-pitch life that cost him dearly. We dedicate this episode to the one and only Diego Maradona. Now, like baseball, I played soccer as a kid and a young adult, and I wasn't that great at either sport, but I loved playing and I loved watching those sports played by the pros. And when I was a teenager, there was nothing that paralleled Maradona on a soccer field. His prime in the 1980s coincided with my impressionable sports years, and he is an amazing and at the same time a confounding story. He is Argentinian, of course. He was born in 1960, grew up in a really poor area outside of Buenos Aires. He was a soccer prodigy, impressing development scouts at the age of 8. And his small but compact size, his stature, that's the best way I would describe him. It might be something more descriptive of a bowling ball. His legs were literally 2 tree trunks, and it was just strange how he stood out of a soccer pitch when you watched a team play because he was small and compact, but he still nevertheless was able to stand out. It was an odd thing to behold. Shorter and wider is how I would sort of describe him. And that helped draw the eyes of fans when watching him. And in 1984, Maradona transferred from Barcelona to Napoli in Italy's top league for a world record fee. It was over $10 million at that time. And this is when I first became aware of him because my family roots tie back to Naples in southern Italy. And my family got excited when they heard about this move. Prior to Maradona's arrival, Italian football was dominated by teams from the rich north, such as AC Milan, Inter Milan, Rome, those types of clubs. Heck, no team in the gritty poor south of the Italian peninsula had ever even won a league title. But here comes Maradona and his working class sympathetic image. And at Naples and at Napoli, Maradona reached the peak of his professional career. He became captain. He elevated the team to the most successful era in its history. And this was when Italy's sort of north-south tensions were at a peak. Now, led by Diego, Napoli won their first ever top league championship in 1986. You had murals of Maradona that were painted on the city's ancient buildings. Newborns were named in his honor, but his off-the-field behavior was a bit troubling. He had problems with cocaine, alleged links to the Camorra or the mafia, yet Naples, town never lost its love for him. And after his death, Napoli's home stadium was renamed Stadio Diego Armando Maradona after the great player. His greatest career feat, however, was clearly the 1986 World Cup when he played for Argentina. He was team captain. Argentina won it all in that World Cup in '86. And throughout the tournament, Maradona dominated and played every minute of every match. And he put on the greatest individual performance of a World Cup match when he scored Argentina's 2 goals in the 2-1 quarterfinal win against England. Now, this is when the UK and Argentina were facing off against one another in the Falklands, which added tension to the game big time. He became mythical after this match, and his 2 goals from that match were very different, but both became legendary. The first goal brought controversy and notoriety. Replays showed that the first goal was scored by striking the ball with his hand. That's, of course, an illegal handball. Maradona was coyly evasive about that. He described it as a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. And it became known as the Hand of God goal. You can check it out on YouTube. And years later, he admitted that he had hit the ball with his hand purposely and no contact with his head was made, and that he immediately knew the goal was illegitimate, but the goal stood, much to the wrath of the England fans to this day. By contrast, Maradona's second goal was electric, just pure electric. Just 4 minutes after the hotly disputed hand goal, his second goal was voted by FIFA as the greatest goal in the history of the World Cup, and it's well deserved. He received the ball in his own half and wove around 5 opposing English players, ran more than half the length of the field to kick it ultimately into the net to score the goal. You have to watch that one on YouTube. It's just unbelievable. Now, by the end of the World Cup, Maradona went on to win the Golden Ball as the best player of the tournament by unanimous vote. Wasn't even close, shouldn't have been close. And the one thing I disliked, I will say, about Maradona was, I guess it was his political persuasions. He was a leftist. He had 2 tattoos on his body, one of Fidel Castro and one of Che Guevara. And he was also buddies with Maduro, the dictator in Venezuela. Boy, that's a murderous lot between the individuals that were tattooed on him and his friends. A murderous lot, literally, unfortunately. But when on the soccer field, boy, there was no one like number 10, Diego Maradona, a sight to behold and one that remains etched in soccer fans in their minds to this day. Episode 199 is dedicated to him. Maradona was ridiculous on the soccer pitch, and seeing with your own eyes and having it documented with data and recorded with media video clips, those things, they serve as tangible proof. We can make our first connection this episode to a very different type of ridiculous, one that's void of substance and data and proof, but one that is connected to Maradona's sport of soccer, where the ridiculous is brought to us by media in this connection. There was an article published in a major mainstream business outlet a few weeks back. The title was, "Soccer Aims to Tackle Its Carbon Problem." Now, I saw that article, could not resist the temptation to read on, knowing there was a good chance I was about to exit objective journalism land and enter into science fiction land. And I was not disappointed, and I wanted to share a few of the items that resonated with me from that story. The author started out with a bang, stating that the world's most popular sport was facing rising threats from climate change. Here's what the author wrote. Flooding, wildfires, and other natural disasters stemming from climate change are posing rising risks to industries around the globe, and the world of sport is no exception. Yes, the message being, if you like soccer, and who doesn't, you've got to be worried about climate change. And it was done and delivered in a very colorful, creative writing style of delivery, not so much news journalism as Hollywood scripting. But the specific data to back that assertion up in the story was very paltry. The reporter cited a UK meteorological office assessment, which, that office is ideologically all in when it comes to climate apocalypse thinking, but used that survey or assessment as a basis to state that a quarter of the stadiums in the UK are at risk of annual flooding by 2050. Of course, there's no way to prove that. No one's going to remember to check this in 2050 for its accuracy, and it's not clear what qualifies as flooding. Flooding is in stadiums submerged under 50 foot of water, or flooding as in the field puddles up during a torrential downpour. It's not clear. The reporter also states that extreme heat stress, that's already causing concern for player welfare around the world. Once again, tough to back up with hard data, and heat sure hasn't seemed to depress the playing and popularity of the sport in hot regions or during summer. Now, that was the fire and brimstone portion of the story, this being a religious story, that of climate alarmism. Next came the acknowledging our original sin as humans and sports fans and as energy users. So check out this gem of a sentence. Now, many clubs are working to mitigate these risks by reducing stadium emissions, embracing sustainable technologies, and working to shape the behavior of fans as the industry comes to terms with its own contributions to climate change. Yes, indeed, right from the pulpit of the Church of Climate. Now here's the repent part of the article, a quote from a sustainability expert. Individual teams have a responsibility to help mitigate this footprint. Soccer has huge environmental accountability, but it also presents a massive opportunity when it comes to the energy transition. Oh, and I should mention that expert that I just quoted works for a corporation who is doing a multi-million-dollar overhaul of a pro soccer stadium in Amsterdam to make it more energy efficient and ESG friendly. Isn't that convenient when a spokesperson for a religion is also profiting from the offering of its followers? By the way, pro sports, including soccer, they are huge carbon hogs and emitters. And to the credit of this story, the reporter stated that fact. The global soccer industry currently produces more than 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year, and that's on par with the annual emissions of Denmark. The most recent World Cup alone, held in Qatar in 2022, generated more than 3.6 million tons. And at club level, if you look at UK League champions Manchester City, Man City, it reported scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions at just over 40,000 tons for the 23-24 season. And I think that's a lowball estimate. Now, all these examples and data prove once again that every activity in a modern economy requires and carries a carbon footprint. It's just that simple. And this pro stadium in Amsterdam, spending millions to put on all the climate religion bells and whistles. The stadium has solar panels, super batteries, and exclusive access to a windmill. It says within the next decade it might be net zero carbon, which all of it, from the solar panels to the optics of the windmill to the hollow goal of net zero someday, they're basically void of substance. The reality is that stadium emits more life cycle carbon than ever, and is probably worse off from a climate and local ecosystem perspective than if it ran off of natural gas and the natural gas powered electricity. And you might wonder, whatever happened to soccer clubs focusing on winning soccer games this season instead of trying to impact climate in 50 seasons or 50 years? Well, that's what most successful clubs are doing. They're focusing on soccer. But there is this team that's cited in this story in the UK where one of its execs said that it strives to be recognized as the world's greenest football club, as recognized by FIFA and the United Nations. I'm not sure how many fans that puts in the seats and how many jerseys it's going to sell. And this exec went on to say, we put sustainability and football on an equal footing. We see a lot of bigger clubs taking on an increasingly good game when it comes to the environment, but then at some point, the football side always overrules sustainability. You don't say. But this exec has a solution, and I think you know what it might be: government regulation. He sees the issue comes down to regulation. Clubs aren't currently legally obligated to report on sustainability, and those that choose to have no clear international framework for doing so. Now, one way around this would be to package environmental regulation alongside other legal requirements, such as financial and safety measures. He quipped in a story, this way, clubs won't think that they're distracting themselves unnecessarily or losing some kind of advantage over others by making changes. Yeah, force the religion onto everyone. That'll make the product of soccer better. Not. And like a good religion, there's also the shaming component of the unholy and unrepentant sinners. The founder of an outfit called Fossil Free Football, yeah, it exists. That's a fan-led organization designed to limit soccer's ties with polluting industries, put it this way. In the past, we concluded that tobacco was so bad for human health that we adopted a ban on tobacco ads, which lowered demand. It's time for a tobacco-style ban on polluting sponsors too, and it's up to FIFA and other football bodies to adopt this. True zealots enforcing the religion, constant listeners. And as to player and team travel to away games, no solution. As to fans attending games and that carbon footprint that they carry with it, the story embarrassingly says simply build stadiums in urban areas, don't put in parking lots, and connect the stadium to a subway or bus line. Like that's going to attract fans, as if that yields a zero carbon footprint. Shoddy reporting to the point of it looking like satire. The debacle of journalism that is this story wraps up by quoting a professor. Our research has consistently shown that sport organizations can lead the way on environmental sustainability, influencing not only people's game day behaviors, but in everyday life as well. Okay, look, reality check. If soccer leagues insist on net zero carbon footprints today, they're going to have to immediately stop playing and marketing their game. So go ahead, Premier League, lead the way offered up by the professor. Let's jump to our next connection by taking a closer look at what these European soccer clubs, like the one in Amsterdam, Ajax, Most Americans look at that name and they think it's Ajax, but it's pronounced Ajax. What they're paying for power if it comes from the unreliable and inefficient forms of energy, such as wind and solar. That stuff that, looks great with its optics of virtue signaling, but that doesn't deliver consistently. And when it does deliver, it costs an ungodly amount for ratepayers. Far middle friend and leading voice in the energy policy and climate policy worlds is author Bjorn Lomborg. He wrote a nice op-ed in the same newspaper that ran the soccer carbon footprint debacle of the story that we just discussed. And he didn't mince words when he stated that the data are clear. The notion that solar and wind power save money is an environmentalist lie, which means all these experts that we just heard from in the soccer story are full of, well, you get the point. Because those data just mentioned show that as nations use more and more supposedly cheap solar and wind power, a strange thing happens. Power bills get more expensive. This exposes the environmentalist lie that renewables have already outmatched fossil fuels and that the green transition, it's irreversible even under a second Trump administration. That's bunk. Believing that green energy is cheaper relies on voodoo economics that measures the cost of electricity only when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. Yeah, modern economies, they don't function that way. We need around-the-clock power, and if wind or sun doesn't cooperate, you need a reliable backup, which is going to be nuke or fossil. And that unnecessary duplication makes the entire grid less efficient and much, much more expensive. The climate zealots are lying to you. The real energy costs of solar and wind are far higher than what is falsely claimed. One study shows that in China, the real cost of solar power on average is twice as high as that of coal. A peer-reviewed study of Germany and Texas shows that solar and wind are many times more expensive than fossil fuels. Germany, the UK, Spain, Denmark, all of which increasingly rely on solar and wind power. Would you know it? They have some of the world's most expensive electricity. Or take climate policy apologist outfit IEA, the International Energy Agency. Take their word for it that what Lomborg is saying is true. The International Energy Agency's latest draft from 2022 on solar and wind power generation costs and consumption across nearly 70 countries shows a clear correlation between more solar and wind and higher average household and industry energy prices. In a country with little or no solar or wind, the average electricity cost is about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. But for every 10% increase in solar and wind share, the electricity cost increases by more than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And this isn't an outlier. These results are substantially similar to prior years, in prior years before pandemic, and prior years before the war in Ukraine. Germany's a great example of this trend that the IEA data highlight. It suffers electricity costs that are 30 cents a kilowatt hour. That's more than twice the cost of America's electricity and more than 3 times the cost of power in China. Germany's installed so much solar and wind that on a sunny and windy day, renewable energy satisfies close to 70% of Germany's needs. And that's a fact that the press and environmentalists, they eagerly report every time they get a chance to. But that same media and that same group of environmentalists, they never mention dark and still days when wind and solar deliver nothing. And twice this past winter, when it was cloudy and still in Germany, solar and wind delivered less than 4% of the daily power needed. That's embarrassing. And don't get mesmerized by what misleading climate alarmists tout as the next big savior, battery storage. Because current battery technology is insufficient, way insufficient. Germany's entire battery storage runs out in about 30 minutes, and that leaves more than 23 hours of energy powered by something other than wind, solar, or batteries. Now, how's that increasingly reliable? This past winter, with cloudy skies and nearly no wind, Germany faced the highest power prices since the energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Power prices reaching a staggering $1 a kilowatt hour. That's nuts. And there's nowhere to hide the egregious cost tied to unreliable wind and solar in Europe or in Germany. The ratepayers and the businesses, they have to pay the crazy rates directly for all to see and suffer. And indeed, everyone there is suffering. But here in the US, it's a little bit different because consumers here pay solar and wind costs indirectly through tax deductions and subsidies. We hide the costs here to hide the pathetic performance and the inflation that it causes from being directly shouldered. Solar and wind credits cost the federal government in the United States more than $20 billion a year. And then that gets supplemented on top of it with state subsidy. Texas received about $2 billion in federal subsidies last year, and state government subsidies at least tripled that cost. This suggests a total hidden cost for the entire U.S. that perhaps runs more than $60 billion annually, implying that the actual cost of electricity with solar and wind, it's far higher than stated prices. And this has to be one of the key areas of federal government excess when the Trump administration focuses its efforts on government efficiency and regulatory scale back and spending reforms. The sooner the better for everyone: businesses, industry, taxpayers, ratepayers, the middle class, workers, and yes, even the climate. I hope you had fun with this week's episode of The Far Middle, but the time has come where we need to tie it together in a fitting final connection. And how about we make a connection to soccer, where we started the episode, but also to an entertainment medium that requires reliable power to enjoy, as in cinema, the movies. One of my favorite movies as a kid. In fact, it was one of the first movies that I can remember watching on a new thing back then known as HBO, on a new thing called cable. And it was the war and sports movie Victory. Actually, the full name of the movie is Escape to Victory. The critics hated it, but it enjoys a decent 70% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, so there. Now, have you seen this one, constant listeners? It's from 1981. And if you haven't, check out the cast in this film. Sly Stallone, Michael Caine, one of the true all-time greats, Max von Sydow, Pele, who most consider the greatest ever in soccer, from Maradona's Argentine rival nation, Brazil, along with a host of other pro players of that era. They starred in the movie as well. Now, Pele designed and drew up the soccer sequences for the movie, which is great. That cast was a unique and memorable cast of big-name Hollywood, classic European actors, and pro soccer players. It combined a World War II drama with a sports on-the-field drama. It's a cool plot. A team of Allied prisoners of war who were soccer players before the war agree to play an exhibition match against a German team, only to find themselves involved in a German propaganda stunt. The POW officers, they want to use the match as an opportunity for an escape attempt, but the player leader fears that such an attempt will only result in getting the players killed. And the plot thickens with escapes before the match, a planned breakout during the match to be held in Paris, and of course, the soccer match itself. Yeah, the Germans, I'll warn you, they played dirty during the game, and the refs, they're biased against the Allied prisoners. The ending is great. I'm not going to give it away. You have to watch it to see it. So your host recommends Victory as a good pick for movie night. Enjoy it this week, and until next week, always stay connected to that far middle.